In this tutorial, you're going to learn how to connect to your SQL Server database to build Reveal dashboards. The first thing we'll do is add a Microsoft SQL Server data connector to the existing application that you built in part 1 of this tutorial. Then we'll implement authentication and data access code. And finally, we'll run your application and you'll see that you can create and save new dashboards in your Windows Forms applications with your SQL Server data. With Reveal, deliver amazing experiences to your customers by digitally transforming your Windows Forms applications with a self-service BI experience in minutes, not days, weeks, or even months. Let's get started. In the previous tutorial, you created a dashboard viewer with the Reveal SDK in a Windows Forms application. In part 2, we are going to create a dashboard creator screen. While the dashboard viewer that you created also enabled editing, so you could edit and save dashboards, in this step, you're going to create a user control that allows you to build dashboards from scratch and then save those. And then, of course, you could reuse them in the dashboard viewer. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we'll need to do is light up this application with a data connector. In this specific example, we're going to be using SQL Server. I have an on-prem SQL Server. You could use Azure SQL. It doesn't matter. The connector will work for either. I'm going to right-click, go to Manage NuGet Packages, go over to Browse, and I'm going to search for Reveal SDK.data.SQL. You can see we have the Microsoft SQL Server package, and I will go ahead and install this and accept the defaults. Now that this is installed, we can add the requirements for enabling this in our project. So the first thing we need to do is go over to program.cs. And in this case, we're going to add a couple using statements. As we do, we're going to be using the Reveal.SDK. We are going to be using Reveal.SDK .data, and we are going to be using reveal.stk.data.microsoft.SQL Server. So those are the three namespaces that are required to light up this application. And we're going to use a few more registrations later on, but first we need to register our data source. So we're going to go to the Reveal SDK settings.data sources, and we want to register our Microsoft SQL Server data source. So as of now, we are good to go with this data source. However, we really can't do much with it yet. What we need to do is add a class, which includes an interface that has a member which will authenticate to our data source. So what I'm going to do is right-click on my project. I'm going to add a new folder, and I'm just going to call this folder Reveal. And in the Reveal folder, I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to add a new class. And this class is going to be called the Authentication Provider. And in the Authentication Provider, again, we are going to be using Reveal.SDK. We're going to be using Reveal.SDK.data. And we are going to be using Reveal.SDK.data. And you guessed it, .microsoft.SQL Server. Now, of course, we could have just written the code and then let Visual Studio tell us what we needed to add, but this is a little bit cleaner. And what we want to do is we want to implement the IRV Authentication Provider interface. I will go ahead and let Visual Studio implement the default Resolve Credentials Async member. We have a throw new not implemented exception. Of course, we don't want that. What we want to do here is create an IRV data source credential object. And of course, we're going to set it to null because we want to populate it. And if it doesn't populate, then it'll return back to the caller as null. But what we're doing here is we're checking that the incoming request for a credential check is a SQL Server data source request. And then we are passing our username and password credentials to the database. So this is your username and password to your SQL Server database. The way Reveal works is you could have an unlimited number of connections to different databases. So let's say, for example, you were using Google BigQuery, SQL Server, and Oracle. You would have the RV Oracle data source, the RV BigQuery data source, and you would have to register those data sources and add the NuGet packages, etc. In this case, all we're doing is using SQL Server, and we're passing the user credential back to the caller. The next step is to now create our user control that will be our dashboard creator. So I'm going to go ahead and add, again, a new Windows Forms user control. I'm going to call this dashboard creator.cs since we had dashboard viewer before. And we're going to go through some of the same process. We're going to add some variables, add element host, etc. So I'll go to the toolbox. We'll look for element host. We're going to add element host. We're going to dock element host within the parent control. And then in the code behind for the dashboard creator, we'll go ahead and set up some variables and things that will enable us to create the Reveal view and then connect to the database. However, before we do that, there is an important step. Anytime you add an interface for Reveal, you have to register it with the application so it's available to any calls from the SDK. So I'm going to open up program.cs, and I'm going to create a new instance of the authentication provider to the Reveal SDK settings, which is sort of the same pattern that we had with the data sources, but we're creating an instance of the class that will be available to the application. So we just want to create a new Reveal authentication provider, and we're done. Later on, we're going to add one more of these called a data source provider, but we don't need that to get going with creating dashboards. So we're good there. Let's go ahead and close this out, and let's go back to our dashboard creator screen. In dashboard creator, there are a few using statements. I'm just going to paste them in for brevity. We're going to be using system IO, Reveal SDK, SDK data, and of course, SQL Server again. And just like we did when we built the dashboard viewer, we'll need some class level variables. I'm going to paste these guys in. We'll use the Reveal view instance. So we'll create a Reveal view object and we'll name it _Reveal view. And then all of the variables we need to find the dashboards folder and the r- files. After initialize component in the constructor, we're going to go ahead and we'll do the same thing we did in our dashboard viewer. Get our default directory. We'll create a new instance of the Reveal view. We'll set our element host to this instance of the Reveal view that we've just created so that will now light up our WPF component in a Windows Forms app. However, there are two new lines of code here. The first one is telling the Reveal view to start in edit mode. This means it will start in that dashboard creation view, and then we are setting the dashboard to an empty new instance of an RV dashboard. Previously, we passed a parameter, which was the sales dashboard, which we wanted to open by default when we loaded up our dashboard viewer. Now we just want an empty dashboard so we can start creating dashboards from scratch. And then the last thing we're going to do is add the event handler for the Reveal view data sources requested event. So this ends up being very important because it's where all of the action happens for creating data sources and data source items, authenticating, and then ultimately giving you the data objects that you need to create new dashboards. So we'll go ahead and add this. I'm going to change this to a capital R, and we're good to go. So now I have my data sources requested. We'll remove our throw new not implemented exception, and we'll paste in the first few lines of code that are necessary to enable dashboard creation. So there's two variables that we want to create, a list of RV dashboard data sources and a list of RV data source items. Those arrays will contain all of the names of the data sources and data source items that populate the dialog, which is in this callback, which you then present to the user to create dashboards. Now, it doesn't mean that they're required. For example, I can leave this empty and my data sources can be empty. I can leave my data source items. I don't have to add anything to it, and this could be empty as well. And we'll see throughout this tutorial the behavior differences when you do that. In this step, we're just going to populate a data source. So I'm going to paste in the prerequisite for that. What we're doing is we're creating a new instance of an RV SQL Server data source called SQL Server data source. And then we're adding the SQL Server data source to the data sources array, which will then populate into the callback dialog. The only thing you have to change is the host, the database, and the title. In my case, I will change your SQL Server name or IP to the name of my SQL Server. So I'll paste that in. And my database is going to be called dev-test. Dev-test is the Northwind database. And that's it. I am ready to go. So as long as you have the correct host, and then in your authentication provider, you're passing the correct username and password, you can now create new dashboards with Reveal. It's that simple. The areas to look out for if you have a problem getting started, remember, register your data source and register the authentication provider. And then in your dashboard creator, make sure that this information is correct. The title can be anything that you'd like. Let's go ahead and test this. I'm going to right click. I'm going to add a new Windows form. My form will be form 2. I'm going to save everything. I'm going to do a build, make sure there's no errors. Looks like there's just some NuGet package warnings, but there's no errors in the code. So in my Windows form, I'm going to set its Windows state property to maximized. I'm going to go over to my toolbox. Let's do a quick search for dashboard creator. There's my dashboard creator. I'm going to change its dock to full screen like so. And you'll see that I already have the default new dashboard experience. Let's go back to our Solution Explorer. Let's go to program.cs. I want to load up form 2. I'm going to hit save and let's go ahead and run. I have my new dashboard dialog, click plus visualization. There's my SQL Server. When I click it, it's authenticated to my on-prem server. And you can see that I have all of my tables, all of my views, and all of my stored procedures. It's that easy. Let's go ahead and grab the orders query. We'll do a select, and let's do the number of employees by country. So this is doing a sum. I want to change this aggregation to count of rows. We'll update that field, and now our chart is updated. And we can check the box, and we can hit the save button, but nothing's going to happen because we haven't implemented the save code. So this new dashboard won't save yet. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. Let's go back to our dashboard creator. Let's add an event handler for the Reveal view. .save dashboard. And there we have our default implementation. We'll change this to capital R and apply, and we're good to go there. What we're going to do here is use the exact same code that we had in the dashboard viewer. So if we go and we view code here, you'll recall that we had code to save the dashboard. So let's scroll down, and there is our save dashboard code. So we can right click, copy this, go back to our dashboard creator. Let's paste this right in. And you'll notice we have a couple red squigglies. What we want to do here is change this to an async void. So we will have an asynchronous save. And we're going to add one additional code block here. One of the issues is when you're creating a new dashboard, the default dashboard name is new dashboard. What I want to do is add some code here that says, hey, if the name is new dashboard, please ask them to enter a valid name before they save this dashboard. And while we're here, let's right click on our project, open folder and file explorer. We'll go to bin, debug, dashboards. This is our dashboard folder. So here we have our marketing and sales, R-dash. Let's go ahead and run this again. I'll do a new dashboard. We'll do the same thing we did before. We'll go to views. Let's do the orders query. I'll select this and we'll do country, employees. I'll do a count of rows. Update this field, employees by country. We'll check the box. Now we'll check the box. Please enter a dashboard name. So let's go ahead here. Call it test demo 1. We will save this. Now our dashboard is saved. Let's go to the file system and we'll see test demo 1 has been saved. So you've just enabled your dashboard creator to add new dashboards with data from a SQL Server database. However, there's more to adding dashboards than just giving your users access to the entire database. What happens if you want to give them a list of curated data items? And this is where you would implement row-level security, parameterized queries, etc. So I'm going to go back to the Reveal folder, and I'm going to add another class. And this class is going to be called the Data Source Provider. The Data Source Provider will use the same using statements that we've used elsewhere. So I'm going to go ahead and copy these. We'll go back to our Data Source Provider. We'll paste these guys in, and we are going to implement the IRV Data Source Provider interface, and this has a single member, change data source item async. And yes, we need to register this now with program CS. So let's go ahead and we'll copy this, paste our data source provider, new reveal dot data source provider. So now this is going to be available to our application, and we're going to use it in the same dashboard creator screen. Essentially, we are going to update the data sources requested with data source items. That's all we're doing here. So in the data source provider, we will remove our not implemented exception, and I'm going to add a few lines of code similar to what we did in the authentication provider. We're checking to see the type that's coming in. In this case, I want to check that this is a request for an RV SQL Server data source item. And then what am I going to do? Well, if the ID coming in is orders query, then I want to set the table that I'm accessing to the orders query table. In Reveal, a table and a view are the same thing. So this is actually the orders query view that I have sitting in SQL Server. If the incoming request is for a data source item and the ID doesn't match, I'm going to return null. So then there's no possibility that data gets out that shouldn't. So this is its simplest form. We're going to add more data source items in a minute, but first let's go back to our dashboard creator and update our data sources requested to populate our data source items. To do that, I am going to add a new function called add SQL Server item. Now, you do not have to do this. However, I believe it makes your code easier to read because we're going to call it from our data sources requested. We're essentially going to pass it our data source item list and the data source, and we're going to populate the array that then we'll be using for data source items. So after I add my SQL Server data source, I'm going to call my function, add SQL Server item. I'm going to pass it the data source items array, the SQL Server data source, and then the ID and the title of what I want to add to the callback to show in this dialog. So now we're going to see something new. We're going to see orders query. So let's go ahead and run this. And I'm going to click plus visualization, and you'll see here I have my all customer orders, which is my data item, and then I have my SQL Server database. So if I select all customer orders, I don't have to go and select a table or a view or a stored procedure. It goes directly into the dashboard designer. At the same time, you may not want your users to have access to everything in your database. So I'm going to comment out this one line of code where we're populating this array, and I'm just going to leave everything else the same. So now when we run this and I click plus visualization, you'll see that I just have my data item. So I'm going directly into the dashboard designer. This is where you have your curated data items that you've pre-prepared in your database that you want users to create dashboards from. You could have as many of these guys as you want. So let's go ahead and add a few more. So I'm going to close this out. We'll go back to our data source provider. And in our data source provider, we just have a single check for the orders query. Let's go ahead and delete this. And I'm going to paste in a new block of code that has a few more incoming IDs. So I've got an ID called 10 most expensive products, an ID called customers, an ID called orders query, an ID called orders by employee, and then of course else this will end up being null. So what's happening here? If the incoming ID is for 10 most expensive products, I want to use a stored procedure called 10 most expensive products. If the incoming ID is customers, I want to do a custom query, select star from customers. If you want to implement row-level security, you have all that set up already in your Windows Forms application. This is where you could add where clauses. So where ID equals, and then whatever your row-level security requires. In this case, I really don't have any row-level security set up, so I'm just doing queries. But you don't have to do straight-up custom queries. You could do stored procedures with parameters. So in this case, orders by employee expects a procedure parameter. This is a dictionary object, so you can have as many parameters as you'd like, and I'm going to pass the ID of 2. So now I've added all these to my change data source item async. I need to go back to my dashboard creator, and I need to add all of these items to our data source items here. So let's delete this line here, and I'll go ahead and paste in a few new ones. And you can see I'm adding 4 items now. And the important thing is our 10 most expensive products, customers, orders query, orders by employee. If we look at what's happening in the data source provider, so in my data source provider, these are our if statements. If the incoming ID is 10 most expensive products, well, there's 10 most expensive products. So we're matching on this string that's coming in. Now, at the same time, let's say you just want to match on the table name. So if the table name coming in is customers, then always do something different. You don't have to always say if SQLDSI.ID. I can say if table, title, etc., then do something unique. In my case, ID works out really well, and it works this way probably for most people, but it really all depends how you're setting up your row level security. So now if I save this and I hit start, what we'll see in my plus visualization is I have 4 items now. I don't have my whole database, so now I'm just building out different ways for users to create new dashboards. In this case, if I drag my 10 most expensive products here, great, I can check the box. Now let's add a new visualization from the customers table. Maybe this one will do something more interesting. Let's do a map, and I will choose the world countries. Our location will be the country. And for the value, we'll just do, again, doesn't really matter here. We can do a count of rows, which is what it did by default. And then we'll change this to customers by country. And we'll check the box. I want my map to be a little bit bigger, which is kind of cool. We'll put that one down there. We'll go ahead and do plus visualization. And I'll do all customer orders again. And we can grab order date, for example. We'll drag order. And this will be not the sum of orders by date, but we want the count of orders by date. We'll change this to orders by date, and we'll check the box. And now we have a new dashboard. So we'll change this to order analysis. We'll save it. Go back to our folder, and we can see that our order analysis R- is there. If we close this now, and let's stop our application, let's change program.cs to load up form 1. And in our dashboard viewer, let's go view code here. If you remember, we were defaulting to sales. Why don't we just open up order analysis, and we'll hit run. And there you can see our order analysis dashboard. So with that and a few easy steps, you created a dashboard creator user control that allows you to create new dashboards and save those to disk. In part 1, you created the dashboard viewer user control. Now in your application, you can use those however you'd like to, so your customers have a beautiful self-service BI experience with Reveal.